And we live.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Agile for Operational Excellence Beyond Software Development webinar. I would like to ask our POMS College of Operational Excellence President, Tor, to give one introduction session.
Thank you very much, Richard, and it's a pleasure to be back for our fifth webinar. Let me share my screen, say a few things about the college before I give the word back to you, Richard, and our absolutely stellar panel that we have with us today to talk about Agile for Operational Excellence Beyond Software Development. Now, before we go into the webinar, I'd like to just first of all, again, remind you what is this? It's actually our webinar series that we started during the pandemic, and this is the fifth in the series. The four first ones have actually received quite a bit of interest online. You can see some of the streams here have over 2,600 views, and they all feature absolutely stellar panelists with top scholars and practitioners in different fields like Lean, Industry 4.0, even teaching, and just in time. And today we talk about another topic in operational excellence, namely Agile. So first, a few words about the college. And the College of Operational Excellence is still one of the youngest and maybe smallest colleges of the POMS, but it is also the coolest and the one where we have the most fun. So this is the team that is running the college in the moment. It's myself, who is the president. We have Richard, who is here with us today, Vice President for Events. Giuliano, VP Outreach. We have Matthias, who is doing the, that's not the events, that should be the competition. And then Jurian de Jong, who is the VP of Finance. We also have very good, of course, advisors for our college, which we all thank for supporting us. I'd like to remind everybody listening today that we have a College of Operational Excellence paper competition. So if you feel like a junior scholar and can prove it, you can submit a good paper to this competition, given that you've already submitted an abstract to POMS. The deadline is in 1 week, so you better hurry up. You should send that to Matthias Thurer, and I'm sure you all got more information about this from POMS, and if not, please reach out for more details. Very importantly, we'd like to thank all our sponsors, which means we can run events like this and other things. If you are not a sponsor, would like to sponsor us, please also contact us. We'll be happy to take some more funding for you so we can do more events, like, for example, this one, when many of us met at Euroma conference in Barcelona last year for a lovely lunch and some drinks. The last thing I would like to say for the college part is that we hope to see you in Atlanta for our mini conference. As always, we run a mini conference before the main POMS conference, and we have a wonderful program this year as well, with a keynote from Elliot Bandeli, one of the editors-in-chief of Journal of Operations Management, which is a wonderful follow-up from the speaker we had last year, which was Rogelio, the other editor-in-chief. We also have Best Paper Award pitches, so please, again, present or submit your best work before we will go to the Coca-Cola Museum and indulge in, I guess, American culture. So that will be lovely before we go back to the reception. It's really a social event where you get to talk to people and learn to know people in a different context. Now, today we're going to talk about Agile for Operational Excellence. And for this, we have three excellent speakers and Richard, who will moderate the talk. Evgeny is a professor at Johns Hopkins University, and he has done some very recent and excellent work in Agile. We'll learn more about that very soon. Together with Tobias Librum, who is a postdoc at the Technical University of Munich, and also founder and CEO of Cyberdesk. So I hope to hear a little bit what that is about as well. And then we have Jeff Pinto, who's very well known for everybody in the Agile environment. He has, I learned, published, I think, 30 books or something like this. So he's been extremely productive over the time, over the years, and we are looking forward to learn from him as well. And then, of course, Richard, who is on the college and who will moderate this debate. And by that, Richard, I'd like to give the word to you, and I look very much forward to learn from all of you. If anybody out there listening now on YouTube have any questions to the panel, please put them on YouTube, and we will make sure they reach the panelists for discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tor. Thank you so much. Let's get right into this exciting topic, Agile for operational excellence beyond software development. I would like to start asking our panelists a couple open or broad questions on Agile. And Agile has its roots in software development, but its principles has been expanding across industries. How would you view Agile in a broader operational context? And what makes it distinct from traditional operations management approaches in non-software settings? For this question, I would like to start with Jeff first, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, it's a great question, but as you say, it's a very broad-based question. So I suppose from my perspective, I sort of have to personalize this and look down at it on some specifics rather than try and cover the broad waterfront. Teaching project management for many years now, one of the things that we have done with students and also in consulting sessions is we tended to emphasize structure. There's a very specific way things have to be done. And so we developed this along the lines, not simply tacitly, but we specifically embrace waterfall and have done that for a long period of time. The problem, as all of us know, is that waterfall sounds good because it provides a sort of pseudo structure that keeps us warm and fuzzy. It allows us to sleep at night because we think we have a structure for how projects are going to develop along that process. The problem that I discovered in my research very early on, in fact, decades ago, is that along the way, we actually have come up with this critical success factor in projects known as client acceptance. Now, if you think about that for a second, it really sounds counterintuitive that we actually found a separate critical success factor for getting projects through the system that meant we had to emphasize client acceptance after the fact. And that begged a very strong question, and that was, why do we have to devote so much energy after the project has been completed in order to get it successfully implemented? And so working our way back, we discovered, and this is really where Agile did so much for my area in traditional project management, is recognizing again that so much of successful project development does occur early, and it does occur in collaboration with the customers very early in the process. It does occur as a result of being willing to listen to users. One of the things that has always struck me is the idea of user stories, as opposed to just getting a bunch of specifications from them. And using these as a springboard to understanding that this is how projects have to be done if they want to be done successfully. When I say successful, I guess the last thing I'll say, and then I'll let other people talk, is the traditional iron triangle that we talk about in project management of time, cost, and functionality has been, I don't want to say it's been discredited, but it's been recognized as being a very poor substitute for what really constitutes successful projects, and that is customer use. That at the end of the day, that they're being used, that they're creating value, that they're providing benefits. Well, think of those two words, value and benefits. Those are in the eye of the user, not in the eye of the developer. And so for me, from my perspective with projects, one of the things that Agile has done is it's been a way that we've really opened the canopy to understand, how do you run a successful project? You have to get beyond the interior and you have to start looking outside of that. And that's where Agile has made a huge improvement on our processes.
Excellent, Jeff. I like your point on the constant engagement with clients or users or customers. That is a key differentiator in this setting right now. What's your idea about this, Tobias? I would like to go to your perspective.
No, absolutely. I think that feedback component is extremely crucial, and it, to some extent, explains why we saw Agile emerging initially, mostly in the software space, where it's extremely costly to start building something, and then only once you display it, once you present it to your customers, you realize, gosh, it's not at all what they were actually looking for. And I think therefore it's a very interesting starting point to say, in software development, I test things very early. I work in small little iterations, get feedback on every iteration, and then it's very easy to insert changes to the code and therefore get a better version of the final product. I think a super interesting question also for the panel today is how does this actually translate to the world outside of software development, where I have my specific challenges, and where the question really is, can I actually apply Agile outside of software? And does it work better? Does it work worse? I think that is a really interesting also avenue for future research. If we reflect on what we know today, I think there are some interesting aspects. So one could argue that, for example, Agile helps you particularly well if the end product is very uncertain. So there's no binary definition of completed, but it's something where you can always iterate and make things a bit better. And that's in fact something where I would argue it's an aspect that holds true even more outside the software world, that you can always improve things. So let's take software, simplified world, either it works or it doesn't work, it's very binary. Outside of the software world, you can always make things better. I'll take your presentation for your next scientific conference. It's never finished, right? You can always make your slides nicer, you can always fine-tune your storyline. And I think that is a very interesting field to understand then what are the implications of Agile in such a setting.
Excellent point. I feel we already have a little bit of convergence about the customer engagement or constant engagement on this point. But I love your point about the, it's not a binary setting. I don't know since when we started the binary thinking about Agile or traditional waterfall approaches and so on. So Evgeny, what's your thought about this?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. I think I'll shift the discussion a little bit more towards research because that's what I know, but I've already learned a ton from Tobias and Jeff, just more about the sort of practical aspects of Agile. So I'll connect a little bit to a couple of things that they said also, and I'll give my 2 cents. So Jeff talked about value and benefits. I like those 2 words, like from the customer perspective, right? That's what Agile is really geared towards, is how do we get the benefits to the customers? And then Tobias mentioned uncertain. And so for me, when I think about Agile, the 2 words that come to mind are optimizing and uncertainty. So we kind of overlap with Tobias on some of the things here. And you know, you asked me about the broader operational contexts. I actually think that when we think about operations, it's exactly the same 2 words that we think about more broadly. It's about how do we optimize a process, and it's about how do we do so under risks and uncertainty, right? I tried to submit a paper once to an operations journal where I didn't have uncertainty. It was when I was a PhD student, and I was told, like, you can't do that. You must have uncertainty in your model, otherwise it's not operations. So I'm sure that you guys those of you who have submitted papers can relate to that. And so I think you know, in some way Agile is synonymous to operations. It is synonymous to applying operations to product development, to innovation. And so I think a lot of the OM research that doesn't use the Agile label actually is about how to make innovation and product development more agile. So I don't even make such a big distinction between the 2. You know, think about a couple of things that Agile involves, right? How do you prioritize tasks in a you know, when you do a backlog or something like that? Well, you optimize, right? You try to rank them somehow. You try to figure out which ones to start with. How do you decide which features to develop, right? Well, you collect customer feedback and you try to optimize and again, allocate time, right? Time allocation is a classic operational problem. So to me, the differences are, you know, to me, Agile is operations and operations is Agile if done well, right? How to optimize a process. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Evgeny. I love your point about Agile for addressing uncertainty or Agile for operational excellence. And I would like to go with another question. It's also a little bit broad. You know, we have been seeing some trends in Agile adoption. So what are some of the most exciting trends you see in the adoption of Agile for operational excellence? Are there any specific industries that are making significant progress in implementing Agile methodologies? Tobias, if you don't mind, I'd like to go with you first. Also, you are seeing a lot of industry changes right now.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it has an interesting component because I'm now working in a startup, specifically a software tech startup, where we are a small team and we can really stick to the principles of working in an agile fashion, which is super easy because of the fairly small team size and no need for long planning. So frankly, we just don't know what's going to happen in 2 years, so we don't have a plan for that. I think the interesting question in terms of industries is how does this actually translate to large organizations? What is working well there? What is not working well there? And while 90% of the organizations nowadays say they do apply Agile, I think it's not entirely clear yet when, how, and where to apply Agile. So there's an interesting distinction between when do I need to be lean? When should I be agile? I think it's fair to say you can be lean whenever things are very predictable and you just want to optimize for avoiding any waste, then you can go for lean. Versus whenever there's uncertainty, then maybe agile is the more resource efficient approach. But that then brings us to the question, which industries, which companies can actually apply that? And while I'm seeing it a lot now, for example, in large financial institutions, that they rearrange their entire operating model in terms of how they organize their teams, how they organize their work. It might work in the financial industry, but it might not work in, let's say, very CapEx heavy industries where you can't say in an agile way, let's plan an airport and realize that the landing strip is not in the right place and I just rebuild it. So I think figuring out this question, what are actually industries, what are use cases for agile is a very interesting and not entirely clear one.
Thank you, Tobias. I'm glad you mentioned the interconnectivity already between Agile and existing or applied methods such as Lean, or sometimes people are labeling this with other terms between Agile and other techniques in industry. Jeff, what's your perspective about this part?
Well, it's an important idea. Tobias raised some interesting points about this, because what I'm seeing and what I think we've all seen is a reflection on this movement is for example, is hybrid. And the development of hybrid to me is a tacit acknowledgement that the pure agile principles don't necessarily apply or shouldn't be simply shoehorned into situations where they're not necessarily likely to fit. So, for example, we talk about, well, why did hybrid start emerging? Well, we know the reasons for this. We talk about things like we're always going to have this battle between flexibility and the need for structure. So you can't simply go in one direction completely. When I was doing consulting, one of the standard jokes with project and the tinkering that goes on in Agile and the constant adjustment is at some point in every project, you have to shoot the engineers and get started. And it's just kind of a reflection that, at some point you have to just kind of make yourself go that direction. Scaling issues, you have problems with that. We have problems with regulatory and compliance. So there are certain industries, for example, American defense industries, where I've done some work with those folks, that they can say, well, Agile's okay to a point. Or healthcare, that was another example. Healthcare, Agile's okay to a point. But then we have to reflect on the fact that we also have regulatory compliance that we have to engage in at various steps. And so it becomes very cumbersome to constantly be I shouldn't say shifting is not the word, but you can only let yourself be open to so many iterations of Agile through these sprints and through Scrum to keep modifying the process before the compliance officer raises their hand and says, wait a minute, now we have to go back and add in these elements as well. And so to me, one of the interesting things about this trend that we're seeing is it's butting up against the reality in many industries of what we are capable of doing under these circumstances. So while people embrace the idea of Agile, they also have some institutional barriers that limit its applicability or limit the degree to which it can be employed.
Very thoughtful points, Jeff. Both of you mentioned the hybrid concept and also scaling point. So I do have a couple questions on that side. We will dig deeper about that. Evgeny, any perspective from you?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about applying it in startups and large organizations, government contracting. I'll add one more that I know a little bit about, which is how Agile is used in sciences and among researchers. So many of the people that I interact with work sort of in biomedical research. And so, for instance, the Broad Institute in Boston or Cambridge, they actually are also trying to implement agile methods across the institute. And what they do is, lots of bio trials, sort of bioinformatic type research. And so it has its own challenges, which I think in some part parallel the ones that Tobias and Jeff talked about, but in some ways are also a bit different. And the questions are like, how do you implement these methods with people who are, like what kind of people work in those organizations? Well, they want to have independence. They want to have autonomy. They don't want to have a scrum master who tells them how to work. And so how does the Broad Institute do that? Well, they have some sort of a loose set of principles. They have a team that goes across the institute and tries to implement them. But I think there's much less of a sort of a top-down approach of trying to implement it across the organization. And maybe that's the kind of hybrid also that we can talk about, is not just what principles to implement, but also how to implement them in the organization. Do you let sort of the team opt into using some sort of agile in their processes, or do you impose that? So I think there's some interesting kind of psychological barriers as well, on top of the sort of regulatory barriers and other types of barriers. And the second part of this is also that it doesn't, even for the type of research that we do, the social sciences, even there actually we can apply lots of agile methods, right? So for instance, when you take a first sort of course on how to do research, you learn about, well, you develop hypotheses, then you go and you collect your data, then you test the hypotheses, then you write up your research. How does that sound like? Well, it sounds like waterfall, right? It just sounds like you do one step after the other, and then you write a paper and then you publish it, and voila, right? We all know that that's not how it works, right? So why not start implementing Agile for your own processes, and you can do it much better with the type of infrastructure that social science has today. Lots of data is collected online. It's very easy to collect a small pilot data set to test, some initial idea. And this is kind of like a market test, right? This is kind of like your prototype. You collected some data, you try to understand how interesting the results might be, and only after that you go back to the next iteration. So I think lots of these principles, they do come from software, but they are already applied, I think, in sort of hard sciences, at least by the Broad Institute, which is arguably perhaps at the forefront of this. But even us social scientists, I think we can and should teach PhD students to apply this and apply it ourselves.
Excellent point. I love your point on Agile for science. Hopefully, many researchers have been adopting Agile for their own research or technical advancement and scientific advancement and so on. So I know all of you have been exploring Agile impacts on performance. So based on your findings, what are the most compelling benefits of Agile in improving operational performance outside software development? For this question, I'd like to go with Evgeny first, and then also I have one follow-up question for Evgeny based on your research.
Well, I'll as I mentioned earlier to you when we were just chatting outside of this, I don't necessarily associate Agile with software development at all. When I was just starting to get interested in this, we had two kind of field visits where we talked to different companies that try to implement these methods. One of which was a company that designs surgical tools. Doesn't sound like software to me, right? So they were literally designing those tools. They were going to the hospitals, to the physicians, then they were giving them some sort of mock-ups and prototypes and having them use them. Then they were going back to their lab and trying to improve those products. Kind of a classic agile paradigm, and that was 15 years ago. That's not something that's very new. They weren't necessarily calling it agile, but it sounded to me like agile. The other one was actually it was back in Michigan. The other one was a company that was trying to consult others on how to do this, and so again, the types of industries they were working in were definitely not just software. They were doing a lot of tool development. I still vividly remember one example where they were trying to develop some sort of a diagnostic tool for car mechanics to inspect cars, and again, a lot of that had to do with how do we build the types of tools that the workers will actually use in their everyday work. And again, this might have to do with being in the Midwest. A lot of these things are non-software. Perhaps if we go to the coasts, especially West Coast, a lot of the implementations will be more software based. But to me, it's not, and it doesn't have to be. I think ultimately the questions are, how do you reduce inertia in the process? How do you be more mindful about what features to build and what features not to build, and how do you build your iterations around this?
Wonderful. So in your research, you examine the role of iteration in driving innovation. So how does iterative work contribute to operational excellence? And what are some potential downsides or risks of excessive iterations?
That's a great question. I mean, Tobias and I and a couple other co-authors have been looking at this from a sort of a psychological job design point of view. And Agile is such a big suite of methods, and so what part of Agile do you focus on? I think the question of iterations and how does that affect people's productivity is a really interesting one. And specifically, we kind of looked at this question of task switching within that. And if you try to understand how agile principles think about task switching, it's mostly negative, actually. There's a lot of talk about, especially in software development, about context switching. You don't want developers to switch context too much. You want them to be focused. At the same time, for us, thinking about innovation and creativity, and thinking about something that Tobias mentioned earlier is about, the more time you spend on something, the less productive you become at that. You can spend more and more time on anything. You can try to finesse the last little details of anything, but what's the value add for the customer? What's the value add for anyone if you spend more and more time on something? And so that would suggest that you actually don't want to spend too much time on any part of your project, right? You actually want to build something quickly, move on to the next part, right? So that's something we were interested in. And so we designed a couple of experiments where we had people do various creative tasks. And we tried to understand, how does the individual workflow affect their productivity? Do you want to have them work in a sort of a waterfall fashion, do one component after the other, spend big chunks of time on each component? Or do you want to be more agile and have shorter iterations, spend only very little time on each component, and then move on, right? So these are what we call agile regimes. We've actually found that for most projects, people learn much faster under those agile regimes. So it's some degree of task switching, some degree of moving between various tasks is actually very good for you.
An interesting perspective, actually. Thank you so much. Tobias, I would like to go to you. So based on your finding, what are the most compelling benefits of Agile in improving operational performance outside software development? Also, I have one follow-up question. Based on your study, you explored how Agile project management improves performance. What key mechanisms drive this improvement? How do they apply in non-software development?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty tough question to give a global answer to. If we really just focus on some aspects of agile project management, I think it's very interesting to see the features suggested by Agile, and one of them is working in sprints. So this idea of I try to accomplish some certain iteration within, for example, 2 weeks of work. And whatever I've achieved after these 2 weeks is my next iteration. And whatever I've not achieved is not achieved. And I think this is a very interesting field to explore, where in our research we actually found that people, when they don't have the pressure of completing something within sprints, they seem to have a tendency to delay their output. And it's not so much the planning fallacy, so the idea that I am just really poor at planning and things just take longer than expected. It's really that even if they know how to allocate their time, they're just not able to move on to the next step on time. And we see that particularly happening for these tasks where you have a somewhat marginally decreasing value add of your work, but no clear endpoint. So I'd say anything that is not very transactional, anything that is creative, anything where you can always iterate more and more is a particularly interesting use case to say, hey, if I don't have clear deadlines on these tasks, then I face a huge risk of spending so much time on the first ones that I run out of time for the later ones. And that's actually a use case where it's very interesting to see that the sprints help tremendously in getting things done, because you overcome this tendency to just waste your time on work with little marginal value add in the beginning and then run out of time towards the end, which is actually something that might work even nicer outside the the software world than the software world itself. Because again, I think in software, you can argue it's binary. Either it works or it does not work. It's not that I can tell my engineers, hey, stop wasting time on it. If it's not working, it's not working.
That's wonderful, actually. I don't know how to capture all those kind of points. It looks like a modeling study could try to find the optimal point based on the settings. I'm not sure that could be one open research questions for the future. Jeff, I would like to come to you. You have done a lot of research for project management, for Agile project management. I think you're one of the pioneers in Agile project management too. So what are the most competing benefits of Agile in improving operational performance outside software development? Also, your research, you have done a lot of research, quantitatively examine Agile practice, Agile project success. So what critical factors influence the success of Agile adoption beyond software development? And how should organizations measure success?
That huge question. Piggybacking, if I could for a moment, on what Evgeny and Tobias both said, they raised some really, really important points about what I've seen in my own research. For example, the notion here of talking about, well, missing, you have run a sprint and let's say you miss, you don't hit all of your targets at the end there. And is that a result of planning fallacy? And the argument was suggested as not really. It's almost, we think of Parkinson's law. Alternatively, what are the causes of that? Well, those are really interesting questions. I tend to agree. I don't think it's a planning fallacy problem. I think many times it's a resource balancing problem in a lot of organizations. But the other issue that came up that was mentioned and had to do with some of my own research and looking at, I think Evgeny was saying this, that when we talk about the structure of a project, the more we build in agile opportunities, the more we build in sprints, or the more that we break the project down into these smaller pieces, as they noted, their research has shown a much more let's use the word as it is, a happier workforce. People tend to be happy working in these smaller chunks. For example, you never hear of project death marches in agile settings. It's not where those things occur. Project death marches are happening in traditional waterfall, where we're just grinding along without the resources and just sort of the end is off there in the distance, but we have no idea when. That doesn't happen in Agile. What does happen in Agile, and this goes back to you mentioned some of my research going back quite a while, is a concept known as psychosocial outcomes. So we think of projects, we think of success in projects really measured on two levels. Number one is sort of the traditional, did the project succeed? And we talked earlier on about what that means, both the internal notion of project management success, time, cost, and functionality, but also project success, benefits, and value creation. And we see that in psychosocial outcomes is one additional way that we can think of a project succeeding, meaning the people involved in it are engaged, They're motivated by it. They're more likely to engage in these successes or these projects down the road as well. They don't finish a project and just shake their heads and say, "Oh, never again." That they're psyched up to do this because of the structure of the Agile setting, that it gives them the opportunity to appreciate and engage in small victories every step of the process, rather than hoping and waiting and praying that at the end of the process, somehow it works out. And this is an avenue for future research that I think is going to be incredibly important, is to see the psychosocial benefits of the sprint or of the Agile setting, and how this really does impact on organizational teams and cause them to want to continue working that way.
Wonderful, Jeff. I think for the Agile side, people focus should be a must-have, not a nice-to-have concept right now. So we have been seeing a lot of hard evidence about Agile adoption success from small team setting or from startups and so on. But for the scaling Agile practice and achieving Agile transformation at a large organizational level, that could be challenging. So how can firms effectively scale Agile practice and achieve enterprise level Agile transformations? I'd like to hear from our panelists your thoughts. Whoever wants to go first, if you're ready. Yes, Jeff?
Just to stick my oar in the water on this one, one thing, there's a couple arguments. One is what they call the small lab setting. And the small lab setting says, we're going to bring Agile in, but we're going to start it in a controlled environment, meaning we're going to do it with 1 or 2 projects. And we're going to make them visible and public so that other parts of the organization can see how this has worked. There's an example of this in a drug manufacturer that used critical chain project scheduling. Well, rather than just make this blanket pronouncement that we're going to put critical chain in throughout the organization, they created an internal lab, if you will, where they had a division that was going to use it. And then at the end of the quarter, they compared their results with the broader results, and they found genuine success. So this same small lab approach I've seen work in many organizations, where rather than make a blanket pronouncement that we're going to engage in Agile, which is always a mistake, because people simply don't understand what it is. They haven't had the background or the understanding, and you hear the word Agile and it opens up the floodgates to multiple interpretations of what that actually is, and everyone then comes up with their own description of it. So rather than do that, we start small, show success, show results, and then gradually build from there. I've rarely, well, I'll even go out on a limb. I've never seen a large organization institute Agile across the board successfully without all kinds of roadblocks. And the problem, of course, as we know, in any organization implementing a major innovation is, if you get it wrong, the natural tendency is drop it immediately, is let's flow back to what worked. Even if it didn't work well, at least we were comfortable with it and we understood it. We may have hated elements of it, but we all got it. When you do it wrong, you give the naysayers the perfect opportunity to start motivating against the move. So just my thought.
Yeah. Tobias, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love what you were saying, Jeff, because I think it's also fair to say that in the corporate world, there's a certain degree of frustration around the term Agile by now, because everyone is walking around and says, hey, we're going to be Agile now, without clearly defining what does it actually mean. And just saying we are Agile and not clearly knowing what do you want to do about it is obviously very frustrating. I think the interesting question is, why is this the case? And why do large organizations tend to say, hey, let's learn from the cool, fast, hip startup world and become a bit more of a startup? And why do they really struggle to do so? And I think it's mostly because some of the principles of Agile are very, very hard to fit into the operating model of a large organization. So if I need to know how to allocate my resources over the next 2 to 5 years, I can't just say, okay, let's not plan, let's just wait and then do it in sprints, right? So I need to have some certain structure. And what I think is very interesting is to see how in large organizations, there's more and more focus now on actually bringing the Agile principles in a structured hybrid setup to reality. So we also have one of the questions now in the chat on the context of Spotify, which is, I think, most famous for introducing the initial concept of scaling Agile by introducing different subgroups. So they call it tribes, chapters, guilds, squads, and the like. Now, the interesting question is, what does it actually mean? And the idea behind it is, let's organize my very big 10,000 plus FTE organization in a way that can work Agile while still making it possible to plan, to steer, to control to some extent. And for that, I think this idea of saying, okay, let's introduce the smallest group. It's, for example, sometimes called the squad. It's a team of probably 5 people, 10 people. There's really working on some sub-problem as one team, as small as Agile unit. Is a very interesting approach of taking the startup, which is probably also 5 to 10 people, to the corporate world. But now you can't have, let's say, 1,000 startups inside one organization. So you still need to somehow organize it. And the way it's done, for example, in the Spotify case, is then to say, okay, let's have these squads, but still have organizations and structure around it. So I can have chapters of people that are belonging to some certain function. I can have tribes which are working in a larger organization on top of it. I can have guilds as interlapping organizations between 2 tribes and so on and so forth. And I think that is something where A, there's no clear standard how to do it, and B, there's a lot of uncertainty how to actually operationalize this. Because Agile would, for example, say usually a resource is working full-time on one sprint, on one topic. Now, what about you need the input of someone for just 2 days, but not more? And the sprint is not 2 days, but actually 2 weeks. How do you make that happen? And I think these are the complexities of really making it happen in a complex organization that are very interesting to further evaluate and understand.
Excellent point. Thank you so much, Tobias, for addressing the question from our audience. I was going to bring that question to our panelists, actually. Wonderful. Evgeny, any thoughts on this?
Sure. I can't speak directly to it because I've never worked for a large organization. But as part of our own research, we've met with a large insurance company in Munich, perhaps one of the largest insurance companies in the world, and they've been trying to implement Agile across many units. And I think one of the things that they've started is exactly what Jeff said, is that it's sort of a lab approach where they would start with perhaps some software teams, and they would expand it to other software teams, that they would expand it to perhaps software adjacent units that do some sort of design and customer interaction. So that kind of approach seems based on what they're doing to work, but it's still, it's work in process there, and they're sort of at the forefront of trying to implement this across a very large organization. I would like to kind of say a couple of words about the question that was asked in the chat, and also something that Tobias mentioned. I think a lot of these terms around implementing Agile, like squads and chapters and tribes, really highlight how important language is when you implement these things, right? It's almost kind of like a how do you make this cool, right? How do you make Agile cool? And I think a lot of these words are there exactly to do that. It's kind of like it's like the Trader Joe's approach to marketing. It's like, let's make it kind of edgy and cool. And I think that's what a lot of these implementations are trying to achieve. And I think language is important, right? A lot of these things kind of fall top down on employees. And so how exactly do you communicate that? How do you message is super, super important. I don't think there's a lot of research coming from academia in terms of how to do that. I think it's all kind of best practices. And this brings me to my last point that I want to talk about on this, which is, I think part of the reason why there's been such difficulties really implementing it in large organizations is because there's actually been very little research that shows that Agile is effective. And who runs large organizations? A lot of people who are MBAs, who have taken business class courses on project management that Jeff and Richard and all of us perhaps are teaching. And what do they learn in those courses? Well, they learn something like, CPM, critical path methods. What does that look like? Well, it looks like waterfall. I think very few business schools actually teach Agile, and part of the reason why they don't teach it or they don't spend too much time teaching it is because there's very little research that shows that these things are effective. And I think that should give us some thought in terms of what to do research on. Perhaps we should be spending more of our time trying to show how effective it is. Yeah, that's all.
Excellent. Actually, I'm glad you mentioned one example in insurance industry. I also have one similar case from insurance sector, actually. So they have been preparing for agile transformation at enterprise level over 1 decade. What they did, they started, of course, they had the buy-in from leadership team, but they didn't start from the top. They started forming many small teams and using agile, particularly from Scrum method. And they achieved many small gains and created many happy small teams. So those small successes created a lot of momentum. So later on, they were ready to scale up to enterprise level. They are still working towards the end right now, but actually there is no end, but they had that slogan to achieve agile transformation by certain years. But I think that is a way to motivate the team to achieve the enterprise level agile transformation. So I think we can naturally transition to next question. So we know, like many of you mentioned, there are some kind of a lack of research in this field. So if I may ask, I want to ask what are some of the most pressing research gaps in Agile for operational excellence that you believe should be explored much further? Jeff, if you don't mind, I want to start with you first. I know you are on a team to do some kind of update about Agile manifesto. So if you can discuss that part, that'd be excellent.
Sure. It's I've been really interested in the comments from Evgeny and Tobias here because they really are solidifying in my own mind some of my thought processes. As you said, Richard, I'm part of a working group. It's an international group, and we're essentially saying the 12 principles of Agile were formulated back with the Agile Manifesto right around the turn of the millennium. Are they still valid? In other words, those principles, as they were laid out 20 years ago, they've kind of taken on the properties of the 10 Commandments, sort of written in stone and brought down from the mountaintop. And so therefore, this is how we all have to view Agile. And that raised a question that we're in the process of working on through a whole series of interactions with looking at these principles and tearing them apart and saying, does this still hold water? Is this still a valid principle that should be used to drive Agile as we understand it? Because I think sometimes a question could be asked that we use the term Agile, and as I'm sure the other two will agree with me, not everybody, people immediately have a connotation in their head as to what that actually means. And half the time it's dead wrong. They think they know what Agile is, and they're absolutely incorrect. We did a study years ago, and we found that we couldn't use the word Agile because we found that 90% of the companies and the people that we asked, do you use Agile in your organization, immediately perked up and said yes. And then when we backchecked them, we found the number was closer to 40%. So they thought they were Agile. They were thinking they were Agile, and they weren't. So to me, part of the issue is, I think where research is going is, first of all, is circling back and making sure that we understand what Agile truly means and that our subjects, when we do studies, understand what we mean by Agile. And then making sure that the Agile principles that were in operation 20 years ago are still the ones that are driving development processes, not just in software, but as it's being used in manufacturing, new product development, even in construction. Make sure that those principles are still the driving force.
Excellent. Tobias, thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'd like to structure the question in a couple of components. I think one is really taking Agile and ask what is Agile and does this really work? So, for example, the existing research shows that it might help increase your quantitative performance. But now there's this interesting work going on to better understand where Evgeny, you also were working a lot on to understand what does it mean in terms of qualitative performance. If I always need to work in sprints, I think it's a very interesting question to explore. Does it mean quality that I deliver in the end is better, or is it worse? Does it help me or hinder me if I'm constrained by the time period that I have to work on? Is in fact structuring things somewhat artificially in, let's say, sprints of 2 weeks, is that helpful, or should I just say I do it on a maybe even daily basis? Like, what is the right time horizon? And if I do it in, let's say, sprints, is it a sustainable setup? I mean, there's this saying, building a business is a marathon, it's not a sprint. Now, if I structure my entire work in sprints, I think the interesting question is what is the long-term implication for that? Does it really make me long-term more productive, or could it be that I'm super productive for maybe 8 weeks, maybe 12 weeks, but then run into organizational burnout? So I think all these practical implementation questions at the smallest and lowest level are super interesting. And then, of course, it's again scaling that up in an organization. Even if I learn it's the most effective way of working like that, can I organize a big organization like that? And finding that out, I think, is not trivial. So it's probably the third component. So practical implementation, scaling it up. And third component is then actually understanding it, because we can do a lot of fantastic lab work. It's not so easy to do field work in this space and really get empirical insights. So I think that is also something that is heavily under research and very interesting and promising to do.
Wonderful. Evgeny?
Yeah, so to piggyback on Tobias, I think we shouldn't necessarily frame the question of agile good, agile bad. I think we'll just get people angry by doing that. I think we should try to pick the thing apart and try to see what parts of agile affect performance or quality in some interesting ways. So I have 4 specific sort of ideas or parts of agile that I'm personally interested in, and by no means these are universal, and but everybody is all open to work on them. One question is scheduling of meetings. Again, something Tobias mentioned earlier is, there's a little bit of work, budding work in the operations management community looking at scheduling of meetings. So there was a paper fairly recently by 2 former department editors of 2 of our major journals, Charles Corbett and Guillaume Rawls, about the frequency of meetings. Do you want to schedule meetings based on the needs, or do you want to schedule them weekly or bi-weekly, and so on? Again, this is just a mathematical model. I think there's lots of potential to study this empirically using field data or using lab data. I think this is a question that's also at the core of Agile. The next for me would be something related to online versus offline versus hybrid in terms of the modality of how people work, right? So many of us work from home. Right now, I'm seeing Jeff is at home, probably. Richard, I don't know. Right? So we all work in these hybrid teams that are located in different parts of the world sometimes. How does that affect Agile implementation? I think that would be very interesting. It seems to work fine because lots of software teams are so distributed, and software is a place where Agile seems to work best. The third question for me is the sort of individual psychology and satisfaction and the need for control, right? So how do we reconcile many of these principles in Agile with the individual need to control their own work processes and their own job design, and at the same time, make sure that people show up for the daily stand-up meetings and they do the things in the sequence that's in their backlog and things like that. And that also piggybacks a little bit on the question of communication, right? How do you communicate it to employees? And then the final one, of course, I have to mention Gen AI because it's everywhere. But I do think that specifically for Agile, actually, a lot of the large language models allow us to be more agile in ways that haven't been explored at all, but I think would be very interesting. Questions like, how do you create mockups and prototypes? How do you use Agile potentially as a sounding board? If you have if you've developed some sort of a feature and you want to get some feedback, can we use those perhaps as a supplement or as a replacement for actual customer feedback. That would be very interesting to me, right? So these are some of the ideas. I think there's many more, but these are just the top of my head.
Wonderful. You give us a lot of specific research questions. Those are great opportunities for researchers to explore. Also, like Jeff and Javier mentioned, from the construct itself to practices to scaling up for enterprise, there are also many wonderful research opportunities. So time flies by so fast. It's already 10:55. So if our audience have any question, please feel free to ask. And otherwise, I would like to ask one more final thoughts from our panelists. Just if you have 1 minute, at most 1 minute, to say something to our researchers or PhD students. So what guidance would you give to researchers and the PhD students who are really interested in studying Agile for operational excellence? What industries or methodologies or data sources should they focus on to produce great outcomes? Anyone want to go first? Feel free to jump in.
I think what's really nice about Agile is that I think it was Evgeny you before who said we can also apply it in academia. And I think it's really one of the rare spaces of research where we can observe our everyday behavior and formulate hypotheses on that we can then validate and use for projects with practice and corporate partners. So specifically, one idea I'd have spontaneously is Agile says I have the team decide on what to do when. So I have my backlog and the product owner says what's important for me, but then the team decides how to distribute this work. Now, this is actually an interesting use case that you could check with your chairmates and discuss, hey, is this actually a working mode that works for me? Or do I feel we're more effective if, for example, my research advisor or someone else actually makes the decision to say what to prioritize, what to focus on. And I think this then triggers the natural research questions, which happen in a similar way also in enterprises and other organizations, which can guide us to interesting research questions.
Thank you. Anyone wants to go second?
Sure. Just 1 minute is tough. So
Yeah,
I guess what I would say is that from a research point of view or suggestion for a research point of view, as has been said all along here, in fact, is the theme of this session is sort of agile past or beyond software. And I think what I would very much encourage people to do is to start looking and seeing how agile is being used. And if you can do cross-industry analysis, for example, of what industries does Agile seem to work best in, and where are there more institutional or roadblocks that are going to make it more difficult? How are you going to modify or recognize the context in which Agile is being used? Bear that in mind, because that's both a admonition, be careful when you study Agile, but also an opportunity for doing, I think, some very creative research in the field.
thank you, Jeff. Evgeny?
Yeah, another theme I think of this entire session has been that Agile is really a suite of methods. There's so many different parts of it, and we just really scratched the surface. But I think it also means for someone who is perhaps a PhD student or just starting to look at these questions, important to narrow it down to perhaps one specific aspect of it or one specific behavior and try to really understand it. And as a behavioral experimental researcher, I'm just gonna do a little pitch for why I think that's a very interesting methodology to study this. I think you can actually link a lot of the agile aspects to the existing literature, and it doesn't even have to be just within operations. It can be within psychology, job design and management, marketing sometimes when you talk about customer feedback. I think there's so many literatures, so much great work that has been done in the past by researchers that have not even thought about agile, but that can be readily applied. And so I would encourage this community to really look into what are the interesting aspects of agile that haven't been properly explored. How can we link it to the existing work? And I think the operations community is sufficiently cross-disciplinary that it's actually very open to these methods, the various methods and the various literatures. So I think the future is bright for agile research. Again, I think a lot of us do work on supply chains. I think supply chain disruptions are all over the news every 10, 15 years when there is some sort of a natural disaster. and then everyone forgets about supply chains. But I think questions around innovation, product development, creativity will always be on top of managers' minds. So I would encourage everyone to do work on this.
Excellent. 1 hour is just so short. I'm very thankful to our panelists. Thank you so much for this great session. And also very thankful to our College of Operational Excellence President Tor, and also the entire officer team, and also the advisory board team for this opportunity, for this session. And I want to mention again, we have the case competition, so please consider submitting your paper to the case competition. Also, we have a POMS annual conference, also college mini conference in May in Atlanta. We look forward to seeing you over there. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Hi, guys.